The government almost always loses when this legal test applies. Strict scrutiny is the highest level of judicial review in United States law. It applies when government action infringes a fundamental right. It also applies when the action discriminates based on a suspect classification. The government must prove the law is necessary to achieve a compelling governmental interest. Necessity requires the law to be narrowly tailored. Narrow tailoring means the law must be the least restrictive means available. If the government fails either prong, the law is unconstitutional. This standard shifts the presumption of constitutionality away from the legislature. Strict scrutiny is often described as strict in theory but fatal in fact. The government rarely satisfies this extremely high burden of proof. Strict scrutiny applies to laws burdening fundamental rights. These rights are protected by substantive due process under the 5th and 14th Amendments. Fundamental rights must be deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. They must also be implicit in the concept of ordered liberty. Examples include the right to interstate travel and the right to vote. Privacy rights are fundamental in areas like marriage, procreation, and contraception. Loving versus Virginia established the right to marry across racial lines. Skinner versus Oklahoma protected the right to procreate. Griswold versus Connecticut protected the right to use contraception. The right to abortion is reviewed under the undue burden standard. It does not receive strict scrutiny review. Economic rights are not fundamental rights. Economic regulations receive only rational basis review. Strict scrutiny applies to classifications based on suspect traits under the Equal Protection Clause. Race and national origin are always suspect classifications. Alienage is also generally considered a suspect classification. These traits involve immutable characteristics. They also involve a history of discrimination against a politically powerless minority. State laws classifying based on alienage trigger strict scrutiny. Federal laws classifying based on alienage trigger only rational basis review. This difference is due to Congress's plenary power over immigration. Laws that are facially neutral but have a discriminatory impact are treated differently. They require proof of discriminatory purpose to trigger strict scrutiny. Without proof of discriminatory purpose, these laws receive rational basis review. Discriminatory purpose means the legislature intended to discriminate. A compelling interest is an objective of the highest possible order. It is rarely satisfied outside of national security or emergency situations. Remedying specific identified past discrimination is a compelling interest. This discrimination must have been committed by the governmental unit itself. Protecting the integrity of the electoral process from fraud is also compelling. General interests are never considered compelling. These include administrative convenience or saving money. Promoting efficiency is also not a compelling interest. The government bears the burden of proof to demonstrate the interest is genuine. The interest must be actual, not merely hypothesized by the court. It cannot be a pretext for discrimination. Narrow tailoring requires the law to be the least restrictive means available. The government must demonstrate this necessity to achieve the compelling interest. The fit between the means and the end must be extremely tight. The law cannot be significantly under-inclusive. Under-inclusion means the law fails to address others who are relevant to the interest. The law also cannot be significantly over-inclusive. Over-inclusion means the law affects individuals not relevant to the interest. If a less burdensome regulation exists, the law fails strict scrutiny. The alternative regulation must achieve the same compelling goal. This requirement is the primary reason most laws subjected to strict scrutiny are invalidated. The court scrutinizes whether the law sweeps too broadly. It ensures the government has chosen the most precise instrument possible. All governmental classifications based on race trigger strict scrutiny. This applies whether the classification benefits or disadvantages a minority group. Adaran Constructors versus Pena established this uniform standard. The only compelling interest for race-based affirmative action is specific remediation. This remediation must address the government's own identified past discrimination. Promoting diversity in higher education is also a compelling interest. However, the means used must be narrowly tailored.
Individualized holistic review of applicants is narrowly tailored. Grutter versus Bollinger upheld this approach. Quotas or mechanical point systems based solely on race are never narrowly tailored. Regents of University of California versus Bakke invalidated quotas. The use of race must be a factor of a factor. Race cannot be a determinative factor in the admissions decision. Strict scrutiny contrasts sharply with intermediate scrutiny and rational basis review. Intermediate scrutiny applies to quasi-suspect classifications like gender and illegitimacy. It requires the law to be substantially related to an important government interest. Rational basis review applies to all other classifications. It requires the law to be rationally related to a legitimate government interest. Under rational basis review, the law is almost always upheld. The government does not bear the burden of proof under rational basis review. The court can hypothesize any legitimate purpose to uphold the law. Strict scrutiny is the only test where the government must prove both the end and the means. The end must be compelling and the means must be the least restrictive. This makes strict scrutiny the most difficult standard to satisfy.